Three, two, one, liftoff.
Cannabinoid Connect, the nation's most diverse cannabis-related podcast.
Yeah, I'm recording. Amanda, welcome to the podcast. It's great to talk with you tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yes, and we were just talking about how beautiful it is where you're at in California, mid 70s weather. Like I said before, in Texas, we got that window of beautiful spring, and then it's straight to summer and hot weather. So let's all enjoy the outdoors as we can before it gets, summertime. But let's start with you, Amanda. I mean, why don't you, for the audience, tell everyone a little bit about yourself. You're the Chief Knowledge Officer with New Frontier Data. So tell us what you do. Tell us what you guys are all about.
Sure. So I've actually been working in the cannabis space for over 20 years. I am a public health researcher by training and actually did my doctoral dissertation on medical cannabis patients back in 2005. I'm a graduate of UC Berkeley. That's why I live here in Northern California. And I've really, been trying to bring science and public health to the cannabis space in a balanced, data-driven way. And as you know, with prohibition and the propaganda that associates with prohibition, the messages we've been getting around cannabis for the past, 50 years have really been anything but data-driven, right? When we talk about cannabis making you lazy, making you stupid, making you crazy. None of that was based on science. That was all based on desires to control certain populations who were using cannabis and then making up lies to support the onerous prohibition that was enforced by the federal government through the drug war. So when I first got into this space, go ahead.
Well, and I just want to say, I mean, isn't it like they've pushed that narrative for so long? And like you said, there hasn't been much data, right, in terms of like backing up that theory, but also like there's been fatigue, I feel like, within the audience. It's like we kind of just brush it off as consumers or even non-consumers because non-consumers know consumers and they know kind of what the effects of cannabis does. So it's like that message, while they still try, it's so played.
It is. And what you're pointing out is great, which is the disconnect between how the public feels about cannabis and how it's treated in a law environment, right? So as you mentioned, I mean, cannabis has been legal for medical purposes, like in the state of California since 1996. We now have a smattering of states across the country where it's legal for adult use. And we see a rise in the number of adult consumers every year. And yet, according to the federal government, it's still a dangerous, illegal substance. We did finally get the Department of Health and Human Services to admit it has medical value this year when they made the recommendation to reschedule it to Schedule 3. We don't know what the DEA is going to come back and say. But to your point, the idea of not being able to do research and not being able to collect data, that was by design. Like that wasn't just, we don't think it's important. It was, well, we can't allow research because if we do, people are going to discover that the basis for having cannabis be so illegal and a Schedule 1 is completely false and baseless. And so for decades, not only was no cannabis research approved that was going to look at any of the benefits of cannabis, but NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, they held the monopoly on access to cannabis for research purposes. So the only way a researcher could get access to cannabis to study it was to go through NIDA to their one garden, and they just didn't approve any of that research. So for so long as scientists, we didn't really have access to the plant. Now, when I started doing my research, I went to the dispensary because I lived in the Bay Area. Dispensaries were out here. So I was able to talk to patients, to talk to people that were actually using cannabis and start to generate value in the knowledge of what it means to be a cannabis consumer and kind of challenge a lot of those assumptions that were put forth. I mean, I was raised in the 80s and 90s. I am a graduate of DARE. I grew up in a very conservative town in Indiana, and we were given a lot of messages about cannabis that I knew from my experience were false, but they were still what were the prevailing messages in our schools, in our government. And so I became a researcher because I wanted to be able to conduct the research that was going to challenge these assumptions and hopefully move the needle on policy. And that's how I spent the first part of my career. Now back to New
So,
Frontier just for a moment. Oh, go ahead. I'm
well, there's just
sorry.
a lot that I kind of want to unpack there. First off, I share the same passion. Obviously, you have tenure, what is it, 20 plus years doing this, right? But we still come from the same position of that, like, I'm just tired of these false claims and this kind of spooky narrative when I myself have, experienced it. I know others that have experienced it. And it's interesting because like I wonder, it's so hard to get through the noise of, like, you mentioned some of the adverse effects, right? Because there are, like any external substance, right? There can be adverse effects. But my point in this being, when you hear about how cannabis can have a negative impact on your health, it's all over the board. It's all over, like with all these different, related issues. Like it could be cardiovascular, right? I just heard something about that come out. Or of course, the schizophrenia narrative, especially young children, right, as their brains developing. So my point is like, even on the adverse side, with data that we currently have now, like, can we pinpoint? Okay, we know for sure there's something here, whereas some of these other claims can just be debunked.
Well, I do think it depends on the source, right? I mean, science and research is all kinds of right? You have on one hand very carefully controlled studies that really look at bias and try to make sure that they control for everything that might, have bias associated with it. And on the other hand, you have large population-based, what we call cross-sectional studies, where you're basically looking at a moment in time. And even though you can show correlation, like one thing is associated with something else, causation, that one thing causes something else, is very difficult to show. And unfortunately, with the media today really competing for attention and the attention spans of the consumer, the public being very, very short, a lot of times they make the jump from correlation to causation because they want people to click on the article. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of misunderstanding about what the research actually says if you're not someone that's versed in how to read research. So, for example, that study that came out about the cardiac condition that you mentioned, right? So they looked at a very large sample of people, which is good, right? You want your sample to be very large, and they looked to see if people had been told that they had a cardiac issue, right? So we're not talking about EKGs. We're not talking about, have you had a heart attack? We're saying, did someone tell you, your doctor or a health professional, that you're at risk for cardiac disease? And then on the other hand, they asked people about using cannabis, but they didn't take out the people that were using it without smoking it. So then the question becomes, all right, are we talking about cannabis? Are we talking about smoking? Like, what's the
Right.
real association there? And then, of course, even with all that noise, the media picks up the story and they're like, cannabis causes heart disease. And then, people are like, oh, well, I don't know how to read research. I don't know how to tell where the biases are. And so they're just going to take that as truth. And that's where we get into what you're talking about, where we have these claims. Now, as you mentioned, cannabis use is not without risk. Of course, it's not without risk. Very few things in this world are without risk, if
Right.
anything, that maybe just sitting perfectly still. But when we really want people to understand those risks and understand their chance of experiencing those risks, it's important that we cut through the media, that we cut through the noise, and that we give people real information. Now, there was a time when it was hard to give real information, one, because we couldn't study it, and two, because as activists, any little nugget we gave prohibitionists about cannabis, they ran with. So if we came out and said, maybe smoking isn't the best method of consumption when you consider health, the prohibitionists would come out and say, see, even the activists say that cannabis is dangerous, so we should keep it illegal. So for a long time, it was hard to have that balanced viewpoint. New Frontier Data, we really specialize in helping people cut through that and understand the realities of cannabis use on both sides. And I also have my own educational platform called Personal Plants, where I really take on that middle ground, right? So yes, we know cannabis has benefits. We also know it has risks. What's the truth there, so that consumers are empowered to make decisions that are going to maximize the benefits of cannabis while reducing the harms?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what the industry needs, right? I mean, actual medical professionals like yourself, doctors who are experiencing it firsthand, studying it so that we can kind of combat some of these negative, narratives that have and false narratives that have flooded, the mass media or even the whole ecosystem, to date. And so I think before I cut you off, I'm sorry, on my other thought, you were talking about how I think in that 20-year span of or in that time, you're like, you got together different doctors and maybe you just kind of said, we're going to take ownership of this and really start to, disprove some of these medical claims. Or, I mean, how did that look?
Well, it wasn't even disproving as much as it was, let's balance the narrative.
Right,
For
right.
so
Yeah.
long, the narrative was cannabis is highly addictive. It makes teen brains go crazy. It makes you unmotivated. You're not going to be a valuable member of society. Like all of these narratives about what it meant to be a cannabis consumer. And I think those of us out there who were consumers and were also medical professionals and public health professionals were saying, we need to balance this. Like we need to conduct research that's going to kind of cast aside these old stereotypes and get to the bottom of what's really going on. And like I said, it's not that it's without risk, but if I'm a consumer, it's a lot more helpful for me to know, hey, this might be riskier than this other behavior when it comes to cannabis, than to just think of cannabis as all good or all bad, which was the message that we were getting for a very long time. And unfortunately, what that did to the regulated cannabis market is it made it very one note. Right. So there was a certain kind of consumer that they were targeting that had certain kind of behaviors that fit the stereotype of who a consumer was. And unfortunately, because consumers are variable, they come from all walks of life,
Absolutely.
all kinds of preferences and tolerances and motivations. It left out a huge chunk of the consuming population that was not able to find products that were meeting their needs. It really turned off a lot of potential consumers because they didn't want to identify with that cannabis culture. And so at New Frontier, we really help companies understand the wide array of consumers who are out there and the importance of offering a wide variety of products, a wide variety of potencies, and better understanding who they aren't getting to and why. And I think for a long time, cannabis was, as an industry, was like, oh, I sell the best weed, so people are going to come buy it from me. But that's not the reality of the consumer in 2024. And so the industry needs to evolve as consumers are evolving.
I love that you brought up that point of the importance of understanding the consumer today, right? And I think before we dissect what that looks like, which you said can vary, right? Because it's so vast. Let's talk about the evolution of the modern cannabis consumer. So the transformation over the past 2 decades, what have you seen at New Frontier Data in this regard?
Well, New Frontier's been around since 2015. And so, studying cannabis consumers since it was only legal in a handful of places. And so, of course, one thing we've seen is the proliferation of adult use states. And as you know, the states that went first, right? So Colorado, Washington, California, these were states that already had pretty extensive cannabis communities, and they had a cannabis culture. They had had medical cannabis for a while. And so when we looked at who these consumers were, it was along the lines of the stereotyped consumers, right? People who like to smoke their cannabis, people that had fairly high tolerances, people that identified with the cannabis culture, that identified as part of the cannabis community. Now that you see states legalizing like Missouri and Minnesota and Ohio, you have a whole new type of consumer, right? You have folks that maybe tried cannabis on the down low a few times. They don't necessarily identify as part of the cannabis culture because their state may have not had a prolific cannabis culture. And they're not necessarily interested in consuming in the same ways as people used to consume. So we're seeing a big reduction in smoking. People wanting to use non-smoked methods of cannabis. I think this was definitely kind of hurried along by the advent of the vape pen. So, inhalation has always been a very popular way to consume cannabis, mostly because you feel it right away. I mean, that's one of the benefits, right? And whether you're a medical patient who's in pain or has nausea and wants that effect right away, or you're just somebody who's like, I want to feel it right now. Like, I don't want to have to wait an hour or measure time.
It's social too.
So
It's communal, right? I mean, it's also, there's that social aspect where you're sharing whatever you're smoking. I mean, if it's a joint or what have you. So
there's that social aspect as well. And, a lot of that under prohibition came because we had to share, because not everybody had their own cannabis because it was harder to come by. Now that people are able to go to the store and have their own, we definitely see more people using by themselves or with just one other person. Part of that is there's not a lot of public spaces where cannabis consumption is allowed. So a lot of people are using at home with their partner or by themselves. COVID also changed that quite a bit. So people being a little bit gun shy about sharing joints, about smoking and putting their mouth on something that someone else has just smoked. I mean, anybody that's been smoking cannabis for a while has been in a circle where by the time the joint gets to you, the end is pretty soggy and you're like, all right, I'm not putting this directly in my mouth. So we definitely saw some behaviors change because of COVID. But I think, now people are using cannabis less as part of a cultural ritual and more as part of everyday life. And that's made a huge difference in not only who consumers are, but how they consume. So people want things like gummies. They want things that they can just pop in their mouth when they're on the go or when they're sitting outside at their kid's baseball game. They don't want to have to look for a place to light up a joint. They don't want their hands to smell like cannabis. They don't want their hair to smell like cannabis smoke. And smoking, in and of itself as a method of consuming anything, has really fallen out of favor with the younger generation. So there really isn't an interest in smoking. A lot more localities have passed laws against public smoking. And so one huge trend we see with consumers is that they're trending towards non-smoked products. And one big way we can tell that is that when we look at current consumers versus potential consumers. So current consumers, about 60% or upwards, say that smoking cannabis is their preferred method of consumption. When you ask a potential consumer, someone who's never consumed but is open to it, if you were to do it, what kind of method would you choose? Over 70% say edibles. And so when we look at that shift, right, we're looking at a group of people that likely were consuming cannabis when smoking it was the only method available to them that had any kind of reliable outcome. And now we're looking at people that are thinking about getting into the cannabis game as consumers when they have access to dispensaries with specifically dosed and predictable effects from edibles, and they don't want to smoke. So, for cannabis brands and cannabis dispensaries, it's important to think about if you're courting the potential consumer, you should have a variety of non-smoked options, and you should also have a variety of lower potency options. So one more thing I'll say about this, and then we can go to the next topic. But, when we ask consumers, what's the most important thing to you when you're picking out a product at a dispensary, potency is number one. And a lot of people assume that that means they're looking for the highest potent product, but that is not true. A lot of them are concerned about potency because they do not want to overdose themselves. They do not want to take too much. And so when they say potency is the most important thing to me, what they mean is I'm looking for lower potency items, because if I take too much, I have a panic, I have anxiety. And so potency swings both ways. So that's why it's important to have a wide variety of potencies available for your consumers.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you described makes total sense, especially that swing at the end for potency, because I mean, I have family members myself that are, older in the boomer generation, and they've had a bad experience with the gummy. And so they want to know, is this over 25%? Is it under? Is it right? So that makes sense. And it's super interesting, the data points that you spelled out. The one that I'm surprised on is the trend that you mentioned of younger people diverting from smoking. So, I'd love for you to expand on that. But then the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, and this is an interesting thing, if you're seeing that more people are moving from for the smoke formulation to the edible formulation, are you seeing any type of non-return to the gummy because so many people have a bad experience if they take too much that first gummy experience? I mean, I can't tell you how many times that I've heard those stories, and I'm sure you have as well. So do you see that as an issue in some areas, or not really? Are they returning?
Not really in the regulated market. So, that definitely used to be an issue in the unregulated market. Back when I first started studying this issue in the early 2000s in California, we had dispensaries and we had flour. None of it was tested. And we had edibles, but they looked more like a bake sale, right? It was like a brownie wrapped in cellophane that somebody made in their kitchen that morning. And you had no idea how potent it was.
Yeah.
And that's when we ran into trouble, right? With people taking too much. Now that we have dosed edibles, here in California, it's 10 milligrams of THC max per piece. We do a lot of education around if this is, you're new to this, cut that one piece in quarters and take one of those quarters and then wait. So I do think we're seeing less, accidental overdosing with edibles. It definitely still happens and it can still be a pretty scary experience. But people are getting smarter about it. Now, one thing that's really helping that, which I love, is the advent of the nano-emulsified products. So this is started off in beverages. We now see it in gummies. So there's nano-emulsified products do two things. One is that they come on onsets like 10 minutes. So one of the big barriers to edibles is that people would eat it, they wouldn't feel anything,
Creeps up on
they would eat
you.
a little bit more, right? And
Yeah.
then 2 hours later, they were like flying and they were way too high. That was a huge barrier to adoption for edibles. Now, 10 minutes, you feel it, you know exactly how much to take. Same with beverages. The other benefit of nano-emulsified products is that because the THC is broken down so small, it doesn't pass through the liver. And that's why you feel it so quickly, the way an edible traditionally would. And in the traditional edible, when that THC passes through the liver, it becomes Delta 11 THC versus Delta 9. And so that's actually stronger and can give more of a psychoactive psychedelic effect. And so people would say, well, I smoked a joint and I was fine, but then I ate this edible and it totally freaked me out. And it wasn't the same kind of high. Nano-emulsified products have more of a high akin to inhalation. So people that are used to inhaling their cannabis use a nano product like a gummy or a beverage, and they're going to expect an effect that's more similar to what they're used to. And so I think that those things are also really going to further along the nano or the edible market. And you're also seeing very, very low dose, like the beverage company has a 2 milligram THC beverage. You're seeing edibles that are 1 milligram of THC. And I think that this is really giving that benefit. So to answer your question about age, when we ask consumers if they smoke only flower, if they use both flower and non-flower, or if they use non-flower exclusively, when we look at those that are age 18 to 34, 22% of them say that they use flower only. And for age 55 and up, that's 28%. So when we get older, we actually see more adoption of flower only. And this is because that's what they're used to. And I'll tell you another data point on that in a minute. But when we look at non-flower only, so people that are not using flower at all, we definitely see the highest rate of that also among the 55 plus. So this is a really interesting age group. Now, New Frontier did a report on gray market consumers. So we looked at people that are consuming cannabis, but not using the regulated market, even though they live in a legal state. And they are primarily ages 45 and up who were using prior to legalization, who consume copious amounts of flower. And so we're really looking at a very certain type of consumer. This consumer also is much more likely to have cannabis be part of their identity. And so there is something in identity that happens when you use the regulated market, when for 30 years, you've been going to this guy and he's been selling you flower and you buy a lot of it and you consume a lot of it and you have this identity around that. All of a sudden going to the store, buying a prepackaged eighth, paying taxes on it, it feels very odd, and it feels a little bit like you're betraying your identity and your past. And so I think that that's a lot what we're seeing with my generation, which is the Gen Xers, which are kind of 45 and older.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I when I'm going to like a legal state like New Mexico to visit family, I'm walking right in. I'm like, this is nice. It's nice to have everything on the shelf and know what you want. And like you said, the dosage and what you're getting from the COA. But yeah, I digress. I want to talk a step further and talk about New Frontier's bread and butter here, right? Which is understanding this consumer evolution for business strategy. So talk to me about the importance of data and comprehending this evolution, and tell me how New Frontier, helps in that regard.
Absolutely. So New Frontier is a data and analytics company. We serve the legal cannabis industry across the country, and we really focus in two areas. One is customers, right? So people that are already coming into dispensaries. What are they buying? What are they spending? What do their baskets look like? Who are they as people? What else are they interested in? So where else do they go? And we use a combination of foot traffic data and point of sale data to answer these questions. So if you're a dispensary and you want to know who's coming through my door, where are they going when they leave? What are they buying? What brands are most important to them? How much are they spending? Who's part of my loyalty program? We can provide all of those insights. And then we can also help with media reach. So we can place pixels and advertisements. We can tell companies, okay, someone saw this ad and then they went into your dispensary, a day later, so they can tell what the value is of the advertising that they're doing. And then, from foot traffic data, we can say, look, 50% of your dispensary people go to the burger joint after they leave the dispensary. So why don't you put an ad there? Why don't you do some cross promotion with them? So one part of this is very much who's coming into the dispensary, what do we know about them, what do we know about their purchasing behavior, and then how do we translate that into strategy for a dispensary or a brand. Now and there's other companies that do that. I think we have a lot more data than other companies, I'm just going to say, but there's a whole other side to this that I think New Frontier is very unique. And that is who isn't coming into your dispensary, right? So if you're not tracking them into the dispensary through their foot traffic, if they're not buying anything from your dispensary, where are they? Who are they? And how do you reach them? And that's where New Frontier's consumer surveys come in. So we do surveys of cannabis consumers, potential consumers, former consumers in all 50 states, so all types of markets. And we talk to them about what are their consumption patterns? Who are they? What are their motivations for consumption? And we can learn a lot about who's not coming into the dispensary. And so I mentioned that report on gray market consumers. We also know who's living in a legal state, going to a dispensary, but maybe they don't know what they're buying, or maybe they have a very unique motivation, and maybe you're not addressing that in your advertising or in your product availability. We talk about the evolution of the consumer, which we've been discussing. So the fastest growing group of consumers are older consumers, and they're primarily looking for health and wellness tools. They do not want to smoke. They want low dose products, and they need education. So a lot of them never have used cannabis before. They really don't know where to start. Giving them a QR code isn't going to help because they may not have a smartphone. We're talking about paper, right? Old fashioned paper that you hand to someone that has information about how to use cannabis safely. It's taking your time and having your bud tender really understand that just saying, oh, try this, it's fire, everyone loves it, is not going to help the 65-year-old woman who's coming in because she has a medical need and she's never used cannabis before. So we really help companies understand who's not coming in and what might be a barrier to access for their brand or their dispensary, so that they can make sure that they're not missing out on a whole group of current consumers or potential consumers because they're so hyper focused on the stereotypical consumer, which is really the high tolerance, high volume consumer, which tends to be a man, 35 and older.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so do you see more and more increased foot traffic among this older generation as it relates to actually walking into these dispensaries? And I mean, because I asked this question because in some cases, if you're a new consumer in the market, it can be intimidating if you don't really know what to ask. Or so, I mean, what is their preferred delivery of the product? Like, I mean, are they going inside the store and purchasing, or are they getting it delivered? Like, what in that?
They're going into the store because
Yeah.
they're not savvy on going online, looking at an online menu, figuring out how to upload their ID. getting it delivered to their house. That's not, they go to stores. This is a generation that,
Brick and
that
mortar.
doesn't use,
Yeah.
that doesn't use Grubhub and that doesn't use Instacart. And, they physically go to the store. And so they want to do that with dispensaries. And there are definitely dispensaries out there that kind of specialize in these populations, that specialize in working with people that are using cannabis for health and wellness, but not enough of them. And it can be very intimidating to go to a dispensary and have a whole bunch of young people in there that are using vocabulary that you don't understand, where the bud tenders are all very young, where you feel like you're getting rushed to make a decision about a product, where you can't just spend time and ask questions. And so we really encourage dispensaries to have at least one bud tender dedicated to education, so that if somebody comes in and they look a little lost, and this doesn't have to be an older person, right? This could be a younger person as well. They have a lot of questions. There's someone dedicated to working with that person. It's kind of like when you go to the bank or something and there's like the express lane for people that are just making deposits. And then there's
Right.
I need to talk to a banker. Or when you go to the airport and there's like the bag drop lane versus I need to change my plane reservation, because
Right.
they don't want someone that just needs to drop their bag to be standing behind someone that needs to change 5 things about their reservation. But they want that person that needs to make changes to have a dedicated person so they feel that they can take their time. So it's really no different. And like I said, there was always this assumption, at least at the beginning, that everyone that was coming into a dispensary already knew about cannabis. And at the beginning of legalization, that may have been mostly true. But as the stigma lessens, as normalization and mainstreaming happens, we're going to see more and more people come in and really not know what they're doing. And going back to our discussion about risk, there's questions that need to be asked, right? We don't want them to overdose themselves. We don't want them to put themselves in a risky situation. We want to make sure we're recommending a product that's matching their intention, their tolerance, their experience, and that can take time.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned mainstreaming of cannabis. So I'm curious, how are we doing? Are societal perceptions changing? I mean, we see the polls, right? 90 some percent of the population is in some kind of support of cannabis, whether it be recreation or a medical. But how is the message being received?
I think it's happening. I mean, I'll say, as someone that's been doing this for a long time and, has been interested in cannabis for longer than I've been working in cannabis, I definitely see a shift. And there's a few ways that I think there's markers that it's becoming mainstream, right? One is when you see prominent people admitting cannabis use. So I would, remember the 90s, Bill Clinton, I didn't inhale, this whole idea that you could not admit to cannabis use and still be thought of or taken seriously as a prominent person. But now we see Olympic athletes and politicians and other leaders admitting that they've used cannabis and still having respect and still getting elected and still winning medals and still having that influence. I think that shows that cannabis is being mainstreamed. It's something that you can say, yes, I use cannabis and I'm also a successful person, and people believe that narrative, right? You don't have to deny it in order to be thought of as a successful person. So I think that's one indicator. The other we've already talked about, which is the fact that older people, who are usually the most conservative, are embracing cannabis. So, when we look at who's using cannabis, you would expect it to be younger folks. But the fact that we're seeing older people, come into the fold, I think is important. The fact that there's so many people talking about being a cannabis consumer and being a parent. So, there was a time during Prohibition when if you were a parent, you never, ever, ever admitted to cannabis use. And there were some very good reasons for that. You could have your kids taken away. You could get challenged during custody hearings for being a cannabis consumer. But now there's all kinds of podcasts and groups and discussions and magazines, all centered around people that use cannabis and are also parents. So I think that's another sign. And then finally, it's the way cannabis consumers are portrayed in movies and television. So I grew up in a time of Cheech and Chong and Jeff Spicoli and Dazed and Confused, where it's and The Big Lebowski. And it was if you had a cannabis consumer on your cast, they were an idiot, right? Or they were funny, right? They were kind of
The
like the
stoner
bumbling,
type.
the stoner type, right? The bumbling, good-natured fool who was like repeating the 12th grade for the fifth time, or was always kind of falling into trouble because they weren't paying attention because they were stoned all the time. That was who the stoner character was, and there was no deviation from that, right? That's who they always were in every movie, in every television show. But if you look over the past decade or so, we see a lot of examples of people using cannabis just in the course of their daily lives,
Right.
who are also thought of as successful, who are also taken seriously, who are also main characters in the story and not just kind of the bumbling sidekick. And to me, that shows a lot, because that's a reflection of society and how society feels about people that engage in these behaviors. And the fact that we can see a group of friends who all have good jobs and are all doing well for themselves sit around a dinner and share a joint, just as we could see them drink a glass of wine, and they're treated the same. I think that that's a huge sign of the mainstreaming of cannabis.
Yeah, I think we're making a dent. I mean, to your point about the films, absolutely, because it's super normalized within that, like you said, everyday life. People are sitting down, lounging. Instead of having to drink, they're choosing to smoke cannabis or edibles, right? Or consume it that way. I just also wonder, like, if the stigma is so powerful still that, like you mentioned, all these different generations are trending towards becoming consumers or trying it, but there's this fear of maybe coming out of the cannabis closet in some ways, right? I mean, I can speak personally for myself. It took me to 2020, right? When everything went down during COVID, I was like, now's the time, because I had been consuming an advocate for a long time within my own personal group. But when I decided to come out, I mean, that was a huge deal. So do you think that there is some hesitancy from this population of 90 plus that are in support of legalization, but maybe they fear for, their job or what their neighbors will think, or like you said, being a parent? What do you think about that?
I think that's very geographically based, right? And so,
Well, sure, you're
here
in
in
California, of
Texas,
course.
I'm
Yeah.
well, I'm not even just in California. I'm in the Emerald Triangle. So like
Right,
I am
right.
in one of the most prolific cannabis cultivation regions of the world.
Right.
And when you say you don't use cannabis, people look at you weird. I mean, it's such a
But
part of the
what if you work remotely in California and you grew up in California, but your job is headquartered in a state that is a prohibition, right?
Well, that's what
Or
I'm
in
saying. Like
Utah. Yeah.
it's all like, what's the risk of you admitting consumption? Now, I live someplace where the risk of me admitting consumption is pretty much nothing. I mean, I don't even have kids. So I don't even have that risk,
Right.
right? I work
Yeah.
remotely for a company that's based in DC. I really basically have, my whole family knows I consume cannabis. Most of them also consume cannabis. My brother works in the industry. So for me, the risk is very, very little. Now, like I said, I grew up in a very conservative town in the middle of Indiana. If I still lived there, the risk would be very much higher. I mean, for one, it's not legal, right? So I'd be admitting to doing something that's illegal. Two, there's still a much higher stigma around cannabis in Indiana because it's not legal there, and they don't even have medical. And, and if I was working at a job where I got drug tested, and so admitting that I used cannabis meant that it might put my employment at risk. All of those things would definitely raise the stigma and reduce the likelihood of me admitting to being a cannabis consumer. So until cannabis is federally legal, until we have no more drug testing, until in every state there's no legal risk of admitting being a consumer, then yes, the mainstreaming and the stigmatization will definitely vary. Although even within a state, Texas is a huge state. As I mentioned, I was just in Austin for South by Southwest. There was a ton of cannabis
Of
consumption.
course. Yeah.
Right? It's Austin, it's South by. The
Right.
police weren't doing anything about it. But if I was, in other parts of Texas, then I would definitely think twice. And the thing I want to add to that is it also depends on who you are, right? So I'm a white lady. Like even when cannabis was illegal, my risk was much lower than it was for other people.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so it's where you live. It's also who you are and how likely the police are to want to know what you're doing and to pay attention to you and to believe you when you tell them what you're doing. And all of those things wrap up into risk. And yes, even though cannabis is being mainstreamed, I would say on the whole, that risk is still very much variable depending on who you are and where you live.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And especially how you said, like, it has to be fully federally legal for the, for really the barriers to fall down. I wonder how things shake out if it's, Schedule 3, moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I mean, I would assume, at that point people would be more open, maybe because it's less, you know, less extreme within the narcotics list, right? Controlled substances list. But I don't know. Am I being hopeful?
Well, no, I mean, I think for medical use, it will change a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
The fact that Schedule 1 means that it has no accepted medical value means that doctors are very wary about recommending something that the federal government says has no medical value. Obviously, the ability to develop FDA approved cannabinoid-based medications is very difficult when they say that it has no medical value. Schedule 1 drugs are extremely hard to research because they're considered to be so dangerous. So it's very difficult for researchers to do that. So I do think that Schedule 3 will open up a lot for medical. I think it will encourage and embolden doctors to start recommending cannabis. I think people that could benefit from cannabis as a medicine but haven't done that because it was Schedule 1 and had no accepted medical value might be more open to trying cannabis as a medicine. And if they're able to develop FDA approved cannabinoid-based medications, those will be covered by insurance. And, a huge barrier to a lot of patients is cost of cannabis. So if they were able to get their cannabis tincture covered by Blue Cross and it was all of a sudden free or $5 versus $55, that would be really helpful, especially for low-income patients. So I do think that all of those things will come with Schedule 3. It still doesn't change the legality of cannabis at the federal level. So cannabis is still illegal at the federal level. It's still a controlled substance. There's just now these very narrow allowances for cannabis use if it's FDA approved, or if it isn't FDA approved, carrying the label saying this is not FDA approved, this has not been approved by the FDA. Cannabis that I buy at the dispensary would not be covered by insurance, even if I have a doctor's recommendation, because insurance is only going to cover products that are approved by the FDA. So I think it's like a little bit of like a squeak in the right direction. Do I think it's going in the wrong direction? No, there really is no wrong direction. I mean, Schedule 1's the strictest we can get. There is no like Schedule 0.5. So,
but if there was, they'd put it on there.
They would put it there. So I think it's moving in the right direction. Do I think cannabis should just be descheduled? Of course. I mean, alcohol is descheduled, and there's no way that you can argue that cannabis is more dangerous to personal, public, or environmental health than alcohol. Absolutely. But I also think, going back to how we opened this discussion, for so long, the government spread so many lies about cannabis that for them to just come at this point and say, yep, we were lying, that was all wrong.
I know, right?
Totally kidding around, that they're not going to do that. I mean, they're the federal government. They rely on authority as the way for people to follow what they say. They're not just going to come out to not to mention a population that increasingly disbelieves a lot of the things that they say and say that they were completely wrong on this. I think they are willing to say it does have some medical value. We do think there's a pathway for cannabis as a medicine, but I do not see descheduling happening for at least a little while longer.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think you're right. Because I'm with you. I mean, deschedule, obviously, like everyone else, right? Pretty much would say that's the best route. But hey, we'll take what we can get. I'm glad you brought up alcohol because, given your background, I know that you really pioneered the topic of how, cannabis can be a really effective substitute when it comes to alcohol use. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are wondering about this topic or even combating it themselves and, trying to make that shift. I know personal friends that are doing that. So talk to me about what you learned studying that topic over the years and what advice you could give to those listening who are struggling with that.
Absolutely. So that came out when I was doing my dissertation research. One of the questions on my original survey was, are you using cannabis as a substitute for another substance? And if so, is it alcohol, pharmaceuticals, or an illicit substance? And what I found was that 53% of my sample were using cannabis as a substitute for alcohol, and 75% were using it as a substitute for pharmaceutical drugs. And that was really interesting to me because this was right at the very beginnings of the issues with the opiate epidemic and with the overprescribing of pharmaceutical drugs. And I knew that a lot of people were using cannabis because the pharmaceuticals weren't working for them. And so, I'm a harm reductionist. That's my philosophy. I believe that abstinence is great for the people that choose it, but that there's a lot of ways for people to reduce the harms associated with psychoactive substances without being completely abstinent. And that might be substituting one substance for another. It might be just reducing the amount that you're using of a substance, but still continuing to use it. So I think there's all kinds of ways to use substances more safely. And when you're talking about alcohol, one of the ways to use alcohol more safely is to, one, reduce your use of alcohol. Two, it's to quit all things, but that's a very small percentage of the population that want to do that long term. Or it's to find a substitute. And cannabis is a really great substitute for alcohol for a few reasons. Probably the biggest one is there's no fatal overdose. So, you can overdose on THC, which basically means you took more than you wanted to and you had an adverse effect, which that could be panic, it could be sleepiness, whatever, but you can't die. And the reason you won't die is because we do not have endocannabinoid receptors in the part of our brain that regulates breathing. So when you overdose on alcohol or opiates to the point of fatality, it's because it shuts off that part of the brain that's telling you to breathe, and you stop breathing and you die. No matter how much THC you consume, that's not going to happen. So, you can take an edible that makes you feel like the world is ending, and that your throat, your heart's beating out of your chest, but you're never going to stop breathing. And so, just on that alone, alcohol's a better choice, or cannabis is a better choice than alcohol. You also don't have the day after effects. So, one of the big issues with drinking too much alcohol is how you feel the day after. You can feel really sick. You can feel really bad headache, really dehydrated. And that can get in the way of your responsibilities, whether that's parenting or work or anything. Cannabis doesn't have that day after effect. Now, if you smoke a ton of cannabis, the next day your throat might be hurting a little bit and you might feel a little tired or groggy, but you're definitely not going to have that incapacitation that you have with an alcohol hangover. Also calories. Alcohol has a lot of sugar in it. So you're basically consuming empty calories over time. That's not good for your health. Cannabis, unless you're only consuming in very sugar-laden edibles like brownies and cookies, doesn't have that same impact. So it's healthier in that way. And then I would also say your decision-making ability on cannabis is different than your decision-making ability on alcohol. When people use alcohol, they tend to make decisions they would never make when they were sober, including decisions to be aggressive, to get in fights, to drive a car. With cannabis, we don't see that, right? So we see the decisions you make while high on cannabis are pretty much the decisions you would make anyway, even when you were sober. And a lot of times you decide to make those decisions and then you forget about them. And then you wake up the next day and you're like, what was I thinking last night? I don't even remember. So the follow through with cannabis is not as immediate as kind of the follow through with alcohol. We also find that driving on cannabis, even though I don't recommend it, has a higher safety profile than driving drunk. So there's lots of safety reasons and health reasons for somebody to choose cannabis instead of alcohol. And going back to the nano-emulsified products, that's why I love cannabis beverages. You take a cannabis beverage, you drink it, you're going to feel the effects in about 10 minutes, very much on par with alcohol. And, for people that are trying to quit drinking or reduce drinking, there is something about holding a drink in your hand, right? There's something about that comfort, that feeling of security of having something to drink when everyone else is drinking, rather just sitting there with your hands in your lap. Right. And so it can really help people get over that desire to drink, get over that craving of having a drink in your hand if you substitute that alcoholic beverage for a cannabis one.
No, those are all valid points. And I mean, that the application there makes so much sense, especially in a social setting where, like you said, you don't want to be the one that's on the outside and not, drinking something. So what a great alternative. One follow-up question is, are you seeing any trends in terms of alcohol use declining in states where we do see legal cannabis?
We do. We do see that. So I know Aspen, Colorado, I believe, became the first city where cannabis outpaced beer in terms of sales. We're definitely seeing declines in beer. I would say that when we talk about the types of alcohol that cannabis is replacing, it's definitely more beer and wine, I would say, than liquor. People that drink liquor tend to be really dedicated to alcohol. It's, something they really enjoy about drinking liquor, whether that's, a nice bourbon or tequila. But people that drink beer and wine, it's more of a social habit. It's something that they're doing when they're out. It's a lighter effect than drinking liquor. And so wine and beer, we're definitely seeing substitution effects. Now we're also seeing additive effects. So we're seeing that people like to do them together. And, that's kind of interesting because alcohol and cannabis tend to have what we call a synergistic relationship, which is like 1 + 1 = 4. So if you've ever had a night of drinking and then you decide you're going to smoke a joint, and then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, like now the room is spinning and, I'm getting way too intoxicated. That's not uncommon. So when I recommend to folks is if you're going to use both alcohol and cannabis, use the cannabis first, because you'll find you can actually get away with a lot less alcohol. So if you use cannabis and then you have your drink and you're usually a 2-drink person, you'll probably only need 1 drink to achieve the same effect as 2 drinks if you start with cannabis. So of course, the safest thing is to not mix them because they can have unpredictable results. But if you decide that's something you want to do, start with the cannabis, especially if you're newer to cannabis. Do not try cannabis for the first time after a night of drinking, because you will not have a good experience, and then you may not want to try cannabis again.
There's some pro tips right there from Dr. Amanda. I like it. See, hey, I'm learning so much, but even, here's something that I can add to my own routine. And no, you're so right though. I mean, I have family members where I've said, don't try cannabis for the first time if you've been drinking before. Like, you need to be completely sober, have that experience and then kind of judge for yourself, depending on the dose or what you intook. My last question for you, I usually kind of do this here at the end as we wrap up, and that is, let's pull out the crystal ball. So future predictions, right? Like, we talked a lot about some of the trends that we're currently seeing in terms of shifts in consumer behavior. But what are some emerging trends that maybe you are going to predict in the coming years? Maybe other shifts in consumer behavior that we haven't talked about, and how companies should prepare to meet these future needs.
Well, I wish I had something like really unique and inspiring to say about this, but we do live in America. We do have capitalism as our driving force for business. So I do see the future of cannabis being like other CPG industries, whether that's coffee or wine or beer. I think there will be very large brands that own a whole bunch of little brands. I mean, the most popular beer in America is Budweiser, even though it's definitely not the best. And so with cannabis, we're going to see the same thing. There will be, large multi-state brands that are the cheapest because they're vertically integrated and they have the best margins and they're able to produce cannabis at the lowest cost. We'll definitely see the higher end craft brands that are going to be more like your high-end wine or your craft beer, where they attract consumers that really are into the product and they really want to like try all the different farms and the different terpene profiles and the different cultivars. And I do hope we'll see appellation development similar to wine, where you'll be looking for cannabis from certain regions, including Mendocino, where I live. But I do think it will end up being pretty capitalized. So, you'll have your General Mills, you'll have your Unilever, you'll have your Kraft, not Kraft C, but Kraft with a K. That will be these umbrella brands. I think they'll buy up a whole bunch of little brands. They'll have their own vertically integrated brand, and people will purchase cannabis on their way home from work, just like they pick up a 6-pack of beer. I mean, we're already seeing that, right? So, when we talk to people about which dispensary they choose, it's convenience, it's location, right? It's like, I'm going to go to the one that's on the way home from work. I'm not going to drive 30 minutes out of my way, even if they have some really cool edible that I like. Maybe I'll do that once a month, but for my regular supply, buy, I'm just going to go to the one that's most convenient, the one that's next to my dry cleaners. So I think we will continue to see that pattern emerge. I do think that manufacturing technologies like nano-emulsion are just going to continue to evolve. So solving some of the issues with cannabis in terms of time of onset, in terms of predictability of effect. So I think we will start to see that. And I do think eventually we'll see the hemp-derived cannabinoid market, which we didn't talk about, but is huge, especially in places like Texas, where they don't have access to the legal market. I think we will start to see that folded into regulated cannabis, where, if you want to produce any type of intoxicating cannabis product, you're going to have to get a license. You're going to have to follow good manufacturing practices. You're going to have things tested, because it really is Russian roulette right now out there with these hemp-derived cannabinoid products. They are banned in some places. They're regulated in other places. They're not touched at all in other places. And that's resulted in a very much pre-prohibition atmosphere like we had with cannabis, where you didn't really know what you were getting. You didn't know the source. You didn't know if it was safe. And we've had some adverse reactions because of that. So I think we'll try to bring that all under the umbrella of cannabis. And then hopefully we're going to see, at the very least, interstate commerce, direct to consumer ability, so that small farmers can have wine club-like systems where they're selling direct to their consumer, so they can sell their jar for $30 instead of $8, which is what they're selling to the dispensary. And then eventually we'll see import and export in the US, just like they have in Canada and countries in South America. And we'll be able to really join kind of the global cannabis industry, which right now we can't.
Hey, I think that's all fair. Really appreciate the predictions, appreciate all the insights. I mean, we talked about evolving profiles of the modern cannabis consumer. We've talked about the evolution of that shift and how it relates to business. You gave us some pro tips as well. If there's any mixing of cannabis and alcohol, which we don't recommend, but if we do, we can go back and share that. But Amanda, I really appreciate your time. I mean, you're super knowledgeable in this area, and keep up the great work with what you're doing with New Frontier. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
Well, if you're a business out there who's looking to understand who your current customers are, or again, who you're not reaching, and who's out there in the customer or consumer or potential consumer eco universe that's not coming into your store, that's not buying your brand, and how you can tailor your messaging for them, we'd love to talk to you at New Frontier Data. We're just newfrontierdata.com. And then if you're a consumer out there who's looking to ingest cannabis in a way that maximizes the benefits and reduces the risk, and you're looking for real public health-based information on cannabis consumption, then you can visit Personal Plants, which is mypersonalplants.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And thanks all for listening. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Cannabinoid Connect, the nation's most diverse cannabis-related podcast.